Welcome, everybody. We're really excited to have you here to join us for the third in our Dive into Data webinar series with DataStream. We're really excited to have Dwane and Laura joining us today. My name's Lindsay. I'm the DataStream Program Manager here at the Gordon Foundation. And Dwane and Laura have been such an excellent resource to us over the years. We're so excited to have them join us for this webinar. I don't think we've ever had a time where we've gotten off a call with them and sort of haven't both been really excited about the conversations that we've been having, but also sort of felt we wish other people could be hearing this. So it's great. It's really exciting to see this webinar come to fruition and to see the great interest and turnout. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. We will be recording this webinar. We'll make it available in the weeks following on our YouTube channel, where you can also find recordings from our other webinars. And the recording from this webinar will have closed captioning. We're not able to provide that live, but there will be closed captions with the recording. The chat bar, please use that to continue introducing yourselves. Let us know where you're joining in from. If you experience any technical issues, just let us know there and our team will look into it for you. And we're also reserving a bit of time at the end of this session for a Q&A. So if you could use the Q&A, as you're listening and questions come to mind, please use the Q&A feature to post your questions, and we'll gather those at the end and hopefully get through as many of them as we can. So if you scroll on your bar at the bottom of your screen or wherever it appears for Zoom, it's the Q&A icon is somewhere around there in the middle, and you can use that to post your questions. So that's it for housekeeping. Before I hand it over to Dwane and Laura, I just wanted to provide a little bit of context about why we are hosting this webinar and why we're so excited about it. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the Gordon Foundation has been working for quite some time now, spending a lot of time and effort and energy thinking about working on how to get water quality data out there. So that it's open and accessible and can be used, importantly, in decision-making around freshwater protection in Canada. So, there's so many excellent programs, monitoring programs across the country collecting data, but it hasn't always been easy to access that information. It's often been a question of knowing who to contact, and then once you've gathered this information, trying to make sense of it all. And that's really a challenge that we were trying to address in building DataStream, which has become the flagship initiative of our water program at the Gordon Foundation. So DataStream is an open data platform for storing, sharing, and accessing water quality data. And it's free and open for anybody to use. And we've really put a lot of effort in trying to make it as user-friendly and as accessible as possible. So DataStream started in the Northwest Territories through a partnership between the Gordon Foundation and the territorial government there. And it's since expanded to grow to other regions across the country, where we've been working in collaboration with other organizations like the Atlantic Water Network and the Lake Winnipeg Foundation. And we're now at a point where we're covering 2/3 of Canada's watersheds, which is really exciting, and have really laid the foundation and the groundwork to continue to expand across the country to become a pan-Canadian platform for sharing water quality data. So at this point in time, we're currently working with over 90 different monitoring groups that are using DataStream to publish and share their water quality data that's being collected at over 5,000 different sites across the country. And these programs range everything from community-based monitoring programs to citizen science, government data sets, everything from municipal through to federal governments, including as well Indigenous governments, as well as academic studies, and researchers are using DataStream to share their results as well. So that's really exciting to see. And one of the things that we found pretty early on in our journey in building DataStream was that every group has a different way of sharing and reporting data. And these often work for the group themselves, but it poses a challenge when you start to bring this data together and think about data reuse, because other people need to be able to understand what's going on. And so that was a big challenge as we were working on DataStream, because we really want this information to be useful as we put it out there. And it was around this time, this sort of critical juncture in our journey, that we started to become more familiar with the work that was happening in the US around the WQX standard for the exchange of water quality data that was being led by US EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the USGS, the US Geological Survey. And in it, we found a system, a standardized way of reporting water quality data, organizing it and structuring it, that really met a lot of the challenges that we were seeing with this data type. As anybody who's worked with it knows, it can be quite a complex data type to work with. And the system had many years of scientific input and thinking behind it that we were able to build on, which was excellent. And it continues to evolve and adapt as well as the field evolves. So it was really, we implemented the WQX standard in DataStream in 2018, and it was really a game changer for us. It really laid the foundation for everything that we've been able to do with the system since then. And yeah, just a real launching pad for us and a tremendous leap forward in terms of being able to share data across jurisdictions and programs in a harmonized way. So we thought at this point, we'd just do a quick poll here to get a sense of those on the call, how familiar you are with the WQX standard. So I'm just launching the poll here. And if you wanna have a look there and answer, are you very familiar, not familiar, somewhat? I'll just wait for a moment for those results to come in. Okay, so we've got, most of you have answered. Majority of you are not at all familiar with the standard. We have a few that are very familiar, a few that are somewhat familiar, and some that have heard of it. So, you know, this is sort of reflective of our experience in talking to people across the country that are collecting water quality data. And why we're so excited to be hosting this webinar, because like I said, we have learned so much from Dwane and Laura and the work that's been happening in the US, and there's a great opportunity here for all of us to learn about it. And I mean, our hope is really that for those that are working with water quality data, that this is the WQX system is something that you do consider, because if we are able to all get on the same page in terms of harmonizing how water quality data is being reported across North America, it could be really, really powerful. So we're really excited to have Dwane and Laura. Before I hand it over, I just want to provide a quick introduction to our panelists. Okay. So Dwane Young is Chief of the Water Data Integration Branch of the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Water. He's worked with the EPA since 2005 and led the initial development of WQX. He has extensive experience with assisting partners throughout the US in sharing water quality data. Laura Shumway is a biologist and the EPA lead of the Water Quality Portal, which is the US system, its centralized system for storing and sharing water quality data. Her work focuses on data quality training, user advocacy, and visioning for data systems in the Water Data Integration Branch. So welcome, Dwane and Laura. We're really excited to have you, and with that, I will pass it over to Dwane.
Great, thanks, Lindsay, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I always find it interesting anytime I engage with a new community or a new group, just how much I learn from that group and the work that they're doing. And just really enjoyed the conversations we've had so far, and I'm really excited to see where you guys go into the future. Okay, great. So also thank you for that introduction as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the history and how we got WQX, where it came from, and the effort that went into it. I'm also going to talk a little bit of philosophy as well, so bear with me on that as I talk about some of the background for why we have data sharing efforts, some of the things that go into data sharing efforts, and some of the challenges that we've run into over the past 20+ years in regards to data sharing. We've got a lot of lessons learned from that, and we continue to learn lessons as well. So first I'm going to talk a little bit philosophy. So let me take about 10 steps back and just think about how do we share data? What happens with data after we collect it? I'm sure a lot of you are involved in the day-to-day data collection efforts out there in the field. You'll notice in both Laura and I's bios, neither of us are IT people. We're both biologists by training, which has actually been pretty valuable as we've been thinking about how WQX should work and what it should do. But you know, you collect a lot of data. We all collect a lot of data, and people collect information out there. And one of the things that we have learned is that electronic data is definitely way more valuable than data that's in file cabinets. So if you've got data that's at least electronic, you've got it managed somewhere, somebody else can find that data, then that's even greater. And we've also kind of learned over time that the more data are reused, that becomes even more valuable. So we spend a lot of money. U.S. spends a lot of money on collecting water quality monitoring data at the federal level, at the state level, at the tribal level. There's a pretty significant investment in collecting data. And if that data can be used for more than one purpose, it's even better. And then kind of that last point there, the shared data are of even higher value. They provide for better planning decisions. They incentivize collaborative efforts. For example, maybe I don't need to go out and collect data at this location because somebody else already has. So I can invest my data collection efforts in a different location to expand what we generally know about the water or the resource. So it really is just a best use of money and a best use of resources. I've been engaged in a lot of data sharing efforts over the years. WQX was one of my first ones, but I've done a number of others as well. And it's been interesting. The conversation is almost always the same anytime I start a new data sharing effort. People will raise their hand and say, you know, we don't really want to share our data because somebody's going to misuse that data. And that can be true. That certainly can be true. I've not seen that happen very often, but that can be true. But one of the things that I'll often respond to that is, well, that may be true, but people are making decisions without your data now. And those decisions that they're making are not very well informed because they don't have your data. And I have a great story that goes along with that. One of the data sharing efforts that I did was around water quantity information. So in the western part of the US, they have a whole series of water rights. And they use that method to be able to determine where water is available to be used for different purposes. And we were trying to get the states to share that information. And in one of the visits to one of the states, we sat down with the state water engineer, and that was the first item they brought up. I said, well, somebody's going to misuse our data. And I gave my normal spiel about how, well, people are making decisions without your data right now. And he stopped me. He says, you are so right. He said, we just had that happen to us. A power company wanted to site a power plant inside our state, but they evaluated our data without talking to us. And they didn't have any of our data, and so they just did their own analysis, and they determined that there wasn't enough water, so they went someplace else. And if they would have only come and talked to us, we would have told them that they would have had enough water to do that. So that state missed out on that opportunity to engage with that entity just because they weren't making their data available. And so after that conversation, the state was all on board with making their data available for better use. So data sharing is a great approach for getting your data out there and making sure that it can be used by others. However, the first step to getting data shared is to really manage it better locally. And that really comes down to making sure that you're documenting all the metadata at that local level. Like, how did you collect the information? What time were you out there? Where were you making the data collection efforts? How did you analyze the data, et cetera? So all of that metadata is really important. And the more you collect and document that up front, the easier it's going to be to share that data later on. So we found that's really critical for having any sort of a data sharing effort. So jumping a little bit into what is WQX. So WQX is a standards-based approach for sharing water quality monitoring data. And when I say standard, a lot of us are familiar with data standards that are out there. There are data standards for all kinds of things out there. We live with data standards in everything that we do. For example, Wi-Fi is a standard, not a data standard, but a technology standard that allows people to buy a computer out of the store and it's going to automatically connect with your Wi-Fi. So data standards are a similar idea. It's basically an agreed upon way for sharing information so that anybody will be able to publish that data using that standard, and people will be able to share that information back and forth with one another. So it defines that common data model, and WQX focuses on water quality monitoring data. And in particular, I'm talking about sampling data. So you go out into the field, you collect a sample, you send that sample off to the lab to be analyzed, and you get results back from that. I will pause just real quickly just to talk about maybe some of the other data that's often collected. Another very typical type of data that's collected out there would be something off of like a water quality sensor. Maybe you've got a pH sensor or a DO sensor but is reading values every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes or every 1 minute. WQX is really not designed for that. The data model for sensor data versus sample data are really quite different. And so WQX is very much designed for the sample data. There are other data standards that are out there, and you may be familiar with some of these standards. The Open Geospatial Consortium has the WaterML2 standard and the Sensor Observation Service standard. Those standards work very well for the sensor data and are designed for that, but those standards aren't really designed for the sample data. And so that's the niche that WQX really fits in, is that it's very well designed for that sample data. It is designed to be automated. The way we designed WQX is we wanted our partners, the states, tribes, other federal agencies, to be able to continue to manage water quality monitoring data however met their needs. But then when they wanted to publish or share that data with us, we wanted it to be automated so they could just push a button and then their data would get pushed to us. The entire validation process would be automated, and then they would get an automated report back saying how their data loaded, what errors there were, et cetera, for them to fix. The other critical thing about this standards-based approach is we really don't care how our states and other partners manage their data. They can have their own systems that they've built themselves. They can buy off-the-shelf software that manages their water quality monitoring data. It really doesn't matter to us as long as they can map or create a WQX data file that is able to be shared with us. And then the other thing that's nice about this is this WQX data format has defined this kind of national standard for how you can publish data. So that's allowed us to be able to engage with other big federal agencies like the U.S. Geological Survey, who is also a major data collector throughout the country. It's allowed us to be able to use WQX as the common language that we interact with them so that they can publish their data in the WQX format and we can as well. And that brings both of our very large data sets together so that the public and anybody else who's trying to use the data can get all the data in one common format. It's kind of funny, honestly, that prior to WQX, the ability for us to engage with USGS on common data sharing methods always ended the same way. We would sit down with them and we would talk to them and they would say, okay, you need to put all of your data into our system, or we would say, you need to put all of your data into our system. And then we would walk away and nothing would happen. The beauty of WQX is that when we developed WQX, we're able to sit down in the room and say, let's both map to this same data model and let's share data that way. And we finally were able to accomplish that after decades of not being able to share data with one another. Just to give you some history, so WQX is really the last step on a very long path. So EPA has been in the business of collecting water quality monitoring data from states and tribes for many, many decades, so at least going back to 1960. And actually, the system that was set up to collect and capture water quality monitoring data is older than EPA. So this was a system called STORAT. We now refer to it as Legacy STORAT. And it was designed as a way for people to be able to publish their data to EPA in a common format, somewhat similar to WQX. There wasn't a lot of data validation efforts. There was a lot of metadata that was missing. And there were a lot of challenges with the data because it was missing the metadata that made it hard to reuse. So there were a lot of complaints back in those days about that it was garbage in, garbage out. And there wasn't a lot of incentive either for the states to provide good quality data because the data really weren't being used anyway. So that resulted in 1998, EPA made a significant investment to modernize that entire process. And the approach that they took was to say, okay, let's create a database. Let's create a database built on top of Oracle. We will distribute it out to our partners. We'll give it to them for free. We'll even give them versions of Oracle for free. And the idea is that they'll run our local database, they'll run our software, they'll run our application as their data management systems. And then once a month, they'll send us a copy of the data. They'll do an Oracle export out of that database, send it to us. We'll process it all into one big database, and that's how we'll share the data. Seemed like a pretty good idea for 1998. Actually, it was pretty advanced idea for 1998. However, for the water quality community and for the diversity of the water quality community, it really just didn't work. Some of the big problems that we had back in 98 up through about 2006 was that the partners just didn't buy into using EPA's database. A lot of the state partners especially said, hey, we already have a database. Why would we use your database? Why you're telling us we need to drop what you're using? Oh, and by the way, yours doesn't do everything we want it to do. Also, we had other big problems with keeping up with the technology. It was really difficult to keep up with Oracle. Oracle would change versions about every year, if not every other year, and we just couldn't keep up with it. It was just not possible for a federal agency to keep up with the technology that was happening. And then also making sure that that technology ran on everybody's computers throughout the country also was incredibly difficult. If you think back to where computer technology was in 1998 through 2005, significant changes happened in those years. You know, we went from Windows was introduced in that time period roughly, and it became more common throughout everything, and there were significant changes in the Windows operating system as well, and so that became a significant challenge for us back in that time. We just couldn't keep up with it. And then that last piece was really the death knell for this system, is that trying to build one system that met everybody's needs was impossible. And as a result of it, it became so complicated that nobody could use it. The system had thousands of screens. It could capture pretty much any type of water quality monitoring data, but because of that, it was so complicated to navigate through that it was very, very difficult to use. And so that was even less incentive for people to use it. So about in 2005, we recognized that there was a problem and that we had to make an adjustment. And so we started looking at a pretty critical change, which was, okay, but we're not going to have this distributed data model anymore, but rather let's focus on standardizing around the science. We know we can't keep up with technology, but the science doesn't change as much. So if we can standardize around the science, maybe that will work well. What I want to talk mostly about on this slide, and I think this is an important factor for you guys to consider as you're making any change in your process, is really just thinking through that change process. Change is hard. It really doesn't matter how good a system it is. You know, I'm a little biased here. I think WQX is an awesome system, but it was really difficult to get buy-in and to get people to adopt the new standard and to change, just because change is hard sometimes. And so really thinking about the people part of the problem is really important. And so we had to, in those first years of WQX, really navigate that change process. That was really critical for how we did that. When we started WQX, we got significant pushback from our user community. They didn't know what we were doing. They didn't understand what we were doing. They didn't understand the whole data standards concept. They didn't understand things like XML. That was all very new to them. And so what we did is we said, okay, we're going to put a big pause on our development right now. We're not going to release the software. Instead, we're going to take a road trip. And so myself and one of my other partners, we did a road trip to several of the regional offices throughout the country, and we invited the states to come and chat with us for that time period. So we had 6 of these face-to-face meetings over a period of about 3 months, and we would spend 3 days with each individual group of people, and we would walk them through the entire process. We also worked with those states that had invested in that prior approach, and we walked them through how they could transition into the new approach as well, and help them through that process as well. We also highlighted early success. So anytime where we saw that somebody was adopting a new data model, we really highlighted them and made sure that everybody could see what they were doing. The other thing that was really critical to some of our early successes as well was having that buy-in from senior leaders. Because when you start to get the pushback, if the senior leaders aren't behind you, it's really easy for them to basically throw you under the bus and say, I don't know why they made that decision. We're going to go back to the way it was before. So having that senior leader buy-in is really critical. We did have some casualties. You know, we did have some people that just walked away and said, oh, we're not going to play your game anymore. And I think the critical thing to understand in that part of the change process is that's okay too. And that it's also okay to make sure that you listen to them, because they probably have some really good ideas. We actually had, in the middle of the WQX change process, one of the original developers of the modernized storette, a very well-respected individual who even I respect tremendously, sent an email to the entire user community talking about what a bad decision we were making. And so I sat down with him and I engaged with him. We invited him to one of the meetings. And at the end of that meeting that he came to, he came up to me afterwards and he said, you know what, I think this might work. That was one of my favorite days in all of that discussion. So really managing the people process is a critical part of any technology change. And like I said, it almost doesn't matter how good your technology is if you're not taking into consideration the people part of the process. So WQX, as I mentioned, it's not dependent on a particular technology. It's based on the science of water quality monitoring, which doesn't change that much. We just released version 3 of WQX a few months ago, and that's since 2006. That was when we released version 1. So that's a pretty significant amount of time that we've been able to stay pretty solid on the actual technologies that we're using. Partners don't have to run our software. They just have to map their data and their systems to WQX. And what that allowed us to be able to do is it allowed us to focus on the core data elements that are needed for somebody else to be able to understand your water quality monitoring data. So when we first started the process, that was one of the things we said over and over and over again. Is this data element necessary for somebody to understand your data, or is it something you just use internally? And that was our critical determination as to what went into WQX and what didn't go into WQX. And that seemed to work really, really well to get us to a common denominator across the entire community. One of the other kind of small problems that we had to solve throughout the process as well was we had a lot of smaller partners that just couldn't adopt the technologies that we were adapting. For example, the idea of extensible markup language, or XML, that was completely foreign to them. They didn't have databases. They were managing data in Excel. And so we did develop an additional piece of software called WQX Web that allows for those smaller partners, or those partners that don't have the IT staff in their shops, to be able to take their data and standardize it in an Excel format, and then teach our system what their file looks like, and then upload their data to our system. And that has proven to be very, very effective for a lot of these smaller partners as well. So just to give you a little bit of background on the progress we've made, and then I'll turn it over to Laura. So since 2004, in 2004 was prior to WQX. So 2004, we had 148 organizations that were contributing data through that modernized STORET system. We had 160,000 sites that were being monitored across the country, and 21.5 million monitoring results. And I was at EPA, this is right before I came to EPA. We were super excited about those numbers. We thought those were excellent numbers. We thought we were doing really great. The growth was looking excellent. We thought things were well. But then if you compare that to where we were 1 year after the release of WQX in 2007, we had 300 organizations contributing data. We doubled the number of sites monitored, and more than doubled the number of monitoring results just in that 1 year. And then if you look at today, so here we are 13 years later, we are now at over 400 organizations with 574,000 sites monitored. That doesn't count the 416,000 that are just coming from USGS. So that's a new thing that's been enabled through WQX and the Water Quality Portal, which Laura will talk about a little bit more as well. And we're now at over 278 million monitoring results that have been shared through WQX. And again, that's not counting what's coming through USGS as well. So you compare that back to where we were in 2004, it's just exponential growth, and it continues to grow. It's just absolutely insane at how much that data is growing all the time. And just to give you some map visualizations of that as well. So this is what it looked like in 2004. And one of the things that you will notice very apparently is there's some gaps. There's some states that just are not even participating at all. No matter how many times we would go visit them and talk to them, they just weren't participating. 2007, this is that 1 year after WQX. You'll notice there still are a couple gaps in Alabama, Virginia is still kind of a gap, and then Massachusetts up there is a gap. But a lot of those really started to fill in, which was really exciting. And then today, the map is really just about all blue. So we've got everybody providing data and submitting data now, and it's just a tremendous improvement in terms of the overall water quality, the overall data availability as well. So I'm gonna hand things over to Laura here in just a minute, but I just want to make one last just remark as you guys are thinking about adopting WQX or incorporating WQX into your system. So one of the other things that I often will do is visit some other countries and talk to other entities about data and data sharing. And it is surprising about how little happens in regards to data standards and where data standards are at throughout the country. The Europeans are doing some great stuff, mostly modeled around the water ML because they're using a lot of sensor data. But in terms of data standards for sampling data, WQX is the only one out there that exists. There really isn't anything else like it. The Open Geospatial Consortium folks are looking at WQX and possibly even adapting that as part of a new water ML structure or trying to figure out how to capture the sampling data. because they've begun to realize also that sampling data just does not fit in the water ML structure. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura, and then I look forward to your guys' questions at the end of the discussion.
Thanks, Dwayne. You hear me all right? Perfect. All right, so I'm the lead of the Water Quality Portal, and the Water Quality Portal is where the data gets served out and published. Still using the WQX standard, but the data gets served out along with the USGS data, as Dwayne mentioned. He did mention just briefly that there are over 400 organizations with data in the portal. And just as a little bit of a background, our states were originally supposed to submit their data, required to submit their data under the Clean Water Act. So they had to submit that information, and so we were, supporting that need with this data standard. We didn't just create it and people came, right? So there was a little bit of a push there, but now we can say that many years later, we have all the states participating. We have over 150 tribal organizations submitting data, over 62 volunteer groups, and many other organizations. So the tribal organizations do have to submit under their Clean Water Act funding grants, but the organizations, in addition to that, do not have to. So they have joined on because they are interested. So those many more organizations, those can be things like Forest Service, Army Corps of Engineers, academia, in addition to all those volunteer groups. As an FYI, I started tracking our progress of submissions more recently. I've only been with us for 6 years, so I don't have the advantage that Dwayne has seen, the growth, but just seeing that in the last year and a half since I started monitoring it, we've increased 40 million results alone. So that's about, we've been averaging around 2 million results a month. So that progression from that original, 20 million, that happens in less than a year now, right? So as you guys continue to expand this effort, you'll see that kind of exponential growth as well, with a current total of 385 million results. Next, Dwayne. This is the use of the Water Quality Portal. So in the past 90 days, we've had over 75,000 users retrieve data from the system. So we obviously have a lot of users contributing data, but we have that many coming back to get the information. With about 87,000 hits, we do kind of have a bounce rate there, but that's really just people hitting the system via the web services. So those are automatic calls to the system with a very short duration. So honestly, those web services take seconds to hit the data and pull back into a user's database. And so that is why they're very quick. What you can see here is that top line is the last 90 days, and the bottom line is the previous 90 days. And I wouldn't say that you see the difference because the exponential growth is happening that much just in the last 90 days, but rather we see influxes throughout the year. So people are more likely to pull data when they're assessing information or when they're going to go out into the field to assess again to see what data is available. So that's really the influx. You'll see a change in how much people are submitting each year. So people are likely not going to submit data during the middle of the summer when they're out sampling, but they'll be maybe retrieving data at that time. So you'll see a different influx of the information. Go ahead and use next. Okay, so this is a really field of dreams approach. So if you build it, they will come. So what I like to say is, we do what we do well. We store and we deliver data for people to use, but we don't really get into very rarely, we don't really get into this is the way you should be assessing data, this is the different tools. We don't create much after that, right? We really leave that to the community, and they've done a really great job. And so here's some of those examples. We have this group called the Water Data Collaborative, and that's a more recent example, but this group has targeted volunteer groups to help them share biological data, so macroinvertebrate data to WQX, and they just sprung up on their own. So we don't sponsor these groups. There isn't anything kind of pushing them to do that. These groups are deciding that this is a really good idea to share this information, and they work together to do it. Similarly, on the right, you can see the furthest, it says water body information. Well, that's an application, a phone application that we had somebody approach us about. So there's this Lake Management Association, NALMS, and they created an application to help their users sample data in the field and record it, electronically. Well, they came to us and said, we want this data to go to WQX. We want to map this directly. And so we help them do that, right? So these are the kind of influx we're getting from the data. So data integration projects. So, and this I highly encourage for you guys who are looking to adopt. Work with other people. One example we have are these tribal consortia coordinating to share data together. So our tribes receive limited Clean Water Act funding because they are small and their extensive waters aren't that large. However, what that means is you have one person doing many jobs, right? They're working across non-point source, they're sampling, they're analyzing, they're being the data IT person. And so what these groups are doing is they're working together, each putting a little bit of money into this effort, and then they're all benefiting from what's being developed to publish that information. We also have some really great examples, which I'll show you in just a moment, is some of our states. I mean, I don't know if you know or if you're familiar with the way the assessment process works in the United States, but each state is required to submit what we call an integrated report every 2 years. So that integrated report is a comprehensive report of all the waters that they sampled and whether or not they're impaired for their designated uses, so swimming, fishing, things like that. Well, some of our states have hit the portal using the the web services to automate those assessments against their water quality standards on the fly, meaning that they can perform these assessments in minutes, whereas before they would have this delay of getting data from all these different organizations, and it would just take months to compile the report in itself. And I'll show you that here in just a moment. One thing we have dabbled in lately is public visualization of the information. So you can see here in that middle image, this is what we call How's My Waterway? And so this is an application meant to help the public understand what's going on with water quality. So this is just one utilization of the water quality portal, but if you were to visit that site, which it was launched a couple weeks ago, or actually last week, if you were to visit that site, you would see that many of our data systems are actually referenced there and integrated. So the more, and I kind of say this to put it into perspective. So you're working on developing water quality system and sharing. How is that going to fit with everything else you need to make a decision? So how is it going to fit with the geospatial information representing that? How is it going to fit with decisions? I mean, what other information do you need to contextualize that result? So just when you're thinking about that, one word to the wise is any standardization, and I don't mean standard as in WQX is a standard. I mean any standardization you can use of like a geospatial framework, like we do some with hydrology, right? So anything you can use to integrate that information and think ahead, the better off you'll be so that you don't have to change those standards in the long run. Next slide. This is the state example I was trying to tell you about. This is from Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, and Jason, he does a much better job of explaining this, but I will limp along. So you can see that we have a requirement that the states solicit all readily available data, and so they would gather data for months. They would reach out to each of those organizations, they would gather the information, and they would reformat that data, right? Because you might call something phosphorus, and the watershed group may call something phos, whereas somebody else might call it just a P, you know, to make it easy in their database. And so somebody has to go in and standardize all that. And then from there, they have to assess the information. So each of those may be done in Excel or Access. I mean, definitely early ways to do this. And then they would submit it to EPA. That's another requirement they have to do. Well, now that same state has taken that 13-month process and turned it into a 12-minute process. I'm going to let that sink in just for a moment. 12 minutes. So they hit the web service for 7 minutes. So it may feel like a lot, but that's not a lot of time when they're pulling every single data record they can for the last 10 years for their state. They don't reformat it anymore. They're using our code to make those assessments. So they're, assessing their E. coli data. They're doing DO, the whole slew of information on the fly, and that takes 5 minutes, and then they have the decisions. So go ahead to the next, Dwane. This is also Jason's slide, but I really love it. Well, what they've done is they don't just run assessments every 2 years now. They run assessments weekly. And so they run these assessments because it helps them figure out if new people are sampling in an area. It helps them adapt their sampling. So let's say USGS started collecting data upstream that's maybe 100 yards. Well, obviously they're not there at the same time, so how else would they know that they're sampling? Well, they're using this to say, oh, well, we don't have to go back to that location. We have the whole slew of chemicals that we need just from that sampling location. And they have said, this is from them directly, that these adaptive sampling plans have saved them $300,000 this year alone because they can reuse other people's information, which is huge cost savings. Not only that is, they're doing assessments every 2 years. And so what I like about Jason's analogy here with this guy in the grocery store is that it's trying to go to the grocery store with a 2-year-old grocery list, right? You're trying to go to the sample for the only information you have is from last cycle, right? And so how do you assess water in the most efficient way if you're not continuously adapting to what's going on? Because a lot of things can change in 2 years. I just showed you that 40 million results were added in a year and a half. So what does that mean for Arizona? They also said that, they're not seeing any surprises. So they're seeing these assessments done so quickly that, when it comes to reporting, they've been able to communicate to their management like, oh, we're seeing a decline in this water, and hey, there may be a problem with the facility discharging into this area, right? And so they can do those early communications and try to get around some of those political issues. You can go next, Dwane. All right, so I'm getting into a little more of lessons learned here and just some thoughts as you guys move forward. So what I would suggest is, we have a set of standardized values. And so that was adapted with the DataStream. And, kudos to you guys for taking that and using it, because there's a lot of lessons learned in that standard that you won't have to have that burden to bear, to be honest. But what we like to do with a lot of our lists, so for example, taxonomy, chemicals, methods, we like to use what we call reference the experts. So I'm going to tell you, I'm a biologist, but I can't tell you that what taxonomy's been changing. I can't tell you the new PFAS chemicals off the top of my head. I don't know what methods have been revised. Don't try to be the source of all information. Reference information where you can. If somebody is doing it well, great, and see where you can collaborate. Data quality. So what we have a standard around is our QA expectations are that our users are QAing that information before it's published. So we have a flag in our data set that says preliminary, which doesn't get published, and final. And so if they have QA'd that information, they publish it as final, and that gets put out. But one thing you may want to reflect on is, if that's your model, how will you check it? If it's not your model, what is your game plan for QA expectations? Knowing that being more rigid causes less people to participate, right? So if you're going to require a really high level of rigor, people are going to get deterred from participating. So just being mindful of balancing that load. Think about data reuse. And so one lesson learned and one big thing that I've had to work through for the past few years is, well, WQX is a fantastic standard, and for it to be in place for as long as it was is amazing. But what we found is that for our nutrient data in particular, some of it was unusable. And I say this in the best possible way, is that we had ambiguous data, and so you couldn't use it, couldn't use all of it for assessments. So think about it ahead of time. You're inheriting a schema that now has those in it. So in that way, you're lucky. But if there's anything else, so what is needed to make decisions with the data? So if you need to have method speciation for your nutrient data, well, make sure that's there, you know? So think about the reuse of the information, not simply what you're capturing at your local level, but rather, you know, how can we make sure that information is reused? That's the point, right? And we've done that with metals and biological data. We've published those up on our website. We'd be more than happy to share that information, any lessons learned around that. Data submissions, another idea is how will you support organizations with varying level of technical capability? Our solution was WQX Web, but even so, it takes a learning curve, right? And I've done many trainings on that system. So what is the game plan for doing that? And so we also have a help desk. So we have a help desk that we have one person who staffs it 50% of the time, and she filters questions back to us or responds to basic questions. But we have a place where we can collate all that information. We can utilize many questions that we're getting often, put out training materials and things like that, webinars, so that we can respond to our user community quickly. And so that's our help desk and user support. We also have a user support team that works on if somebody has a question or they're getting an error that they can't understand, that we'll respond to them, 24 hours and help them through that. So we sit on a lot of Skype calls. Next. Successes. And so I think something I just want to reiterate. So it is required for our states and tribes that receive Clean Water Act 106 grants to submit their data. I know you guys aren't in that situation. So consider that when you're thinking about your expectations here. So Dwane and I can go and cheer you on and, tell you guys to submit all this information, which I wholeheartedly agree. But just be mindful that you may not see the growth, the same growth we did, right? Because that it's not going to be as quick in some ways because there's not that pressure, that regulatory pressure. But I think you guys are definitely inheriting a better system in general. We also have what we call an Exchange Network Grant Program. So the Exchange Network Grant Program is this opportunity for people who want, this can include volunteer groups, to apply to share their information with EPA. And so that means they can receive funding to support a submission to one of our systems. So for example, it's not just WQX that's in one of those programs. It's also, decision information. It's drinking water information. So there's this whole program focused on trying to help people through the data submission, the IT process. It's a competitive program and not everybody receives that, but it is a support mechanism that we have for people who want to share information. Another success is WQX schema. Like I said, it was backwards compatible for 13 years. Meaning that we didn't have to make any changes to make things required to make that data usable. So we just changed it for the nutrient information and some biological data, but for 13 years it was really great. Some of the successes I like to think about was the capturing of detection limits. So that had such great forward thinking, and I like to say it's nothing I would ever think of. It's just making sure that, oh, you don't have a result. Well, what was the detection limit on that value so that people can use that in lieu or however they want to use it for that value. Fields are created and used for one purpose only. So if, have good descriptions around the field and make sure that you're not going rogue a little bit on them and making sure that they're being used for a single purpose to alleviate confusion for data submissions and reuse, as well as the WQX flexibility. That was a really big benefit for us. Next. Challenges. So we are haunted by historical data, and I mean that, I was going to say in the best way, but no, it is kind of a bane of our existence at times. So because of the old STORAT model, and Dwane describes that, it's not the same format as WQX. And so what that means is, when we've merged the data sets together, they didn't fit. And so, not perfectly at least. So there are holes in the old data that we just can't get back. So Sorry, someone was calling my phone. So we just can't get that information back. And so oftentimes when we're running QA checks or things like that, we have to remedy that. And that's another thing that you guys won't have to deal with if you're starting with this version. Balancing required values, recommended, and optional. And what I mean by this is everybody wants a data set to be perfect. That's a given. However, you need to balance that with the idea that some things are recommended and you've given best practice for it and you don't require that, because when you get an error, it is very frustrating. And I've received a lot of errors from WQX. So make sure you're not pushing off the community and trying to add a ton of required values. And because you want to make sure that you can get as much participation while also making sure that you have very valuable and reusable data. Maintaining data flow. So this sometimes happens is like people have a hard time just keeping this automated system up. And so that can be difficult for people, and thinking about that timeliness of data submission. So sometimes people only submit once a year. And so if there is some expectation or goal that you guys have for using information, make sure that's known. I mean, get that expectation out there. You guys are just kicking this off. And so maybe it's 3 times a year that people submit data. Maybe it's monthly. Maybe it's every spring and fall so that the data is available for assessments. And then the other challenge is sensor data. I think that's it, Dwane. The other thing that I like to say is, you know, we don't have to be the source of all things cool, right, with our data. So do what you do well, and let people build and expand and try to make it their own, because that's the point of it all, to reuse that information, right? So that's my spiel, and I'll talk to you guys later.
Thanks so much, Laura and Dwane. That was an excellent presentation. I'm so happy you were able to join us. We don't have a lot of time left for Q&A, so I'm going to jump right in there. And our first question was actually regarding the development of the Canadian Water Agency, which is something that's front of mind for a lot of folks in the water community for us these days. And wondering whether we anticipate this agency playing a role in helping establish a water quality data standard in Canada. I'm not sure how familiar Dwane and Laura are with that. And I'm not a representative of the government myself, but what I can say is that we have, in our experience with DataStream, been able to fairly easily adapt the WQX standard for the data types of data that we're seeing across the country, with some small tweaks, for example, to include VMV codes, which a lot of governments use. So I think the good news there is that we do have something to build on. That data standard that we use for DataStream and WQX are available on our GitHub site, so the code behind those, and we can definitely share that link when we share the link for the recording as this as well. So just moving on to the other questions, we have a question, Dwane and Laura, do you ever see inputs from industry groups?
I'll take a crack at that. Occasionally, it's pretty rare that we get data from them. So the industry folks are required to submit discharge monitoring reports. Those go into a different system. It's part of their permit requirement. But sometimes they do also collect just ambient monitoring in addition to those permits, and some of those share that data, but it's pretty rare.
Okay, thanks, Dwane. Another question is, have you seen the WQX standard being used in other countries besides its use in DataStream in Canada?
Not yet, no. A lot of the other countries, it's kind of an interesting thing in terms of the type of data that are being collected. The other countries that I've engaged with, aside from the Europeans, are mostly collecting things like DO, pH, temperature, not as much of the other parameters that you would normally do via sample. And so most of them are doing that with sensors that they've deployed, and so they're mostly using the WaterML standard. And so only the countries that are doing sampling data would probably have an interest in WQX, and there's surprisingly not that many of them.
Great, and I think I'm going to skip, just in the interest of time, to our last question, and then if we have time, we'll move back up, because it's a question that I think really ties everything together nicely. Thanking you guys for the presentation. This the description for this webinar states we will learn about the impact that WQX has had on mobilizing water data in North America. And so the question is, could you reiterate how WQX relates or could relate to Canadian watershed data?
So I can take a first crack at that, and Laura, feel free to add in anything else that you think I might miss. So I think the potential that exists here is there are several watersheds, especially if you think about the Great Lakes region as well, and some of the other watersheds out west and up in the New England area that cross borders, right? And being able to share water quality monitoring data across the border would be super valuable. The only way to get to that is if we're using the same standards and the same language and the same terminology. So I think WQX is certainly a path forward to get to that. The same way that WQX allowed USGS and EPA to be on the same page in terms of water quality monitoring data, I think a standard like WQX could help the two countries get together on the same page as well. So I think there's a lot of tremendous potential there. In terms of how it could apply in Canada, so one of the things that we discovered as we developed WQX and the WQX data model is that there's really only so many ways to model water quality monitoring data. If you were to sit down with a blank piece of paper or to sit down at your computer and say, okay, I want to capture water quality monitoring data. These are the data elements that I need. Here's how I'm going to structure this information. The chances are pretty high you would come up with something that looks pretty similar to WQX just because there's not that many ways to model that type of data. And so as a result of that, WQX is a great place to start. Even if you don't adopt WQX, it's a great place to start to look at and say, okay, these are the data elements that I would use, and this helps me at least inform the work that I'm going to do. And Laura, I don't know if you had anything else you want to add.
I think the only thing that I would add is that almost all of our headwaters start in Canada. So it only behooves the United States to collaborate with you guys. And to be honest, I think this could just be the beginning. I mean, there's so many other areas to collaborate on, you know, standards, assessments, hydrology. And so I think this could just kickstart a lot of that work and collaboration.
Thanks, Laura. And I'll just add to that too, like I mentioned at the outset, I mean, WQX has been fundamental to DataStream, and we are now covering 2/3 of Canada's watershed. So all the data that is being shared on the DataStream platforms is formatted in a model that's aligned with WQX, which is really exciting to see. So it's definitely possible and happening, and I think really sets us up well for better transboundary collaboration, both within Canada and across that national border as well. So I think I want to make sure that we finish on time for those who have to jump off. Thank you everybody for joining us today. It was great to see the interest that we've seen, and to Dwane and Laura for sharing your experience. I think it's so valuable for us to hear, and I'm really happy that we're able to share this more broadly. We will be sharing a recording of this webinar on the DataStream YouTube channel. Sorry, this slide here has some more contact information for us at the Gordon Foundation and the DataStream Initiative, so please do stay in touch. We'll send out a link with the recording, and definitely take note of all these questions here and see what we can do to get answers for everybody. So thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.